Derrick. I'm the Director of Texas eFiling here for the state of Texas. Really what I'd like to do is just to go through 3 different topics with you guys. First, I want to start off and just go through an eFile Texas overview. Just to level set, make sure everybody in the room is on the same page, everybody understands what the eFile Texas program is. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the filing mechanics, how it all works. And lastly, we'll go into a timeline and how it impacts you guys here in Wichita County. Just first, I want to start off with an overview. eFile Texas, what is eFile Texas? eFile Texas is the new e-filing manager here in the state. Previously, there was an e-filing system here in the state of Texas, and it was a system called Texas.gov. It was run by a company called NIC. And if you had e-filed in the past, prior to 2013, you probably used that system. The new eFile Texas system is just replacing that system that previously existed, and we're bringing it here to the state of Texas. Secondly, the eFile Texas application is administered by the Office of Court Administration. So the OCA is who our contract and agreement is with. The reason why that's important is because in the previous vendor, they had individual contracts and agreements with each individual county. And what that netted was a different experience from the filing community, whether you were filing in one county or another. Certain product features and enhancements were added to the system in certain counties, but weren't added to others. So you may have had an experience where you were filing in one county, but maybe filed in a different county and had a different experience. With the contract and the agreement with the Office of Court Administration, they're really guiding our development strategy. So all the new features that we put into the e-filing application is in the best interest from all the counties across the board, not just the big Harris and Dallas counties, but some of the smaller counties as well. Lastly, eFile Texas is powered by a company called Tyler Technologies. Tyler Technologies has been in the courts of justice business for the last 35 years. We focus on nothing but the public sector. That's all we do, is to just focus on public sector. And so what we're doing here with the eFile Texas program is we're bringing this e-filing system. It's the same system that we're leveraging in 14 other states around the country, implemented in several of those right now statewide. We're bringing that Odyssey File and Serve product to the state of Texas and rebranding it under the name eFile Texas. So it's the same application, we're just changing the name to make it more suitable for this great state. If we take a look back into what e-filing was prior to eFile Texas's existence, we see a footprint that really accounts for about 54 of the 254 counties across the state that had e-filing in some flavor or capacity. Also, 10 of the 16 appellate courts had e-filing as well. Now, out of those 54 counties, even though it only makes up about 20% of the population here in the state, in terms of counties, the population in terms of individuals and people was about 80%. So those 54 counties made up 80% of the population in the state because it was large areas like Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Austin that had access to e-filing. Now the interesting thing about e-filing back then is that although 80% of the population had access to it, only 10% of those folks actually used it. We think that there's several reasons on why. Cost, maybe not a seamless integration, maybe not an easy-to-use system. But there's several things that we think that we can bring to the table to help overcome that and bring that percentage up much greater. One of the things that we don't have to do that's really driven by the Supreme Court is to help drive that up. It's a mandate that was passed in 2012. So as far as the Supreme Court mandate, Tyler Technologies got awarded the statewide contract in about October of 2012. And in December of 2012, the Supreme Court came out and issued a mandate stating that all the counties across the state would have to use electronic filing for all non-criminal pleadings beginning on January 1 of this year. So we started it out and focused on the Supreme Court mandate, which had different milestones and basically rolled it out in a 6-month iterative process. That graduated schedule started out at the beginning of this year, focusing on those counties that had a population of 500,000 or greater. That accounted for the top 10 counties in the state. That's the Harris, the Dallas, the Tarrant, the Collin, the Denton, the Hidalgo, the Fort Bend, the El Pasos, the Travis. You guys get the idea. From there, it took a step 6 months down the road, which we're quickly approaching, which is July 1st of this year, where it focuses on the population of 200,000 or greater. It takes another 6 months down to January 1, where the counties that are 100,000 and greater have to be live and mandatory on electronic filings on all non-criminal cases. That's where Wichita County falls in. Now, it follows this 6-month iterative process all the way down until July 1st of 2016, where it focuses on those counties that are the smallest in population. So we have to implement a system that's capable and suitable for counties the size of Harris County that have 4.5 million in population, all the way down to Loving County in July 1st of 2016 that has a population of 82. Okay? So if we look at eFile Texas today and the footprint that we have here in this state, it's a little bit different. What we've been able to do is we've been able to bring on all the counties that were mandatory by that January 1st deadline, but then we also brought in a list of counties that were previously on that e-filing system. What we did is we transitioned those counties over into our system so that that other system could cease to exist. That all took place before January 1 of this year. Now, if you look at the footprint today, you can actually see that about 68 counties, and this number is actually increasing, it's about 70 today. 70 counties are currently using e-filing in some capacity. What we say in some capacity is that it's some flavor, meaning that the district clerk may be using it in some counties, but maybe the county clerk wasn't, and vice versa. If you look at it from the appellate court system, all of the 16 appellate courts, including the Criminal Court of Appeals, all of the civil appellate courts, and then of course the Supreme Court are using the system today. The interesting thing about these counties and the makeup of these counties is that if you look at the graph up here, we've actually implemented a county in each one of those different milestones that the Supreme Court rolled out with their mandate telling us that we had to implement versus the population size. What this gives us the ability to do is leverage our experience that we've acquired over the last year of implementing this system and use that experience and leverage it as we go in and implement like-sized counties in terms of population. If we were to look at how eFile Texas works at a high level, 50,000-foot view, this is what it would be. You start off by creating the documents like you create the documents today. If you're creating an original petition or maybe a motion or even an affidavit, you're creating these documents just like you do today. The only difference is the filer creates them in the form of an electronic version called PDF. Now, if you're familiar with using Microsoft Word or even WordPerfect, you have the ability to save that document as not a doc file, but as a PDF file, and now you're ready to e-file. So the filer creates their document much like they do today when they file it over the counter, but they create it in a PDF document, and the filer uses what we call an electronic filing service provider, EFSP for short. These electronic filing service providers are just entities that act as portals to obtain that information that you're filing so that they can then turn around and pass it to the e-filing manager, which is eFile Texas, so that the clerks can review that information. Now, this EFSP is an open market, and so we'll talk about the EFSPs here in just a minute, but the reality of an EFSP is just the ability to obtain the information from the filer and then pass that information to the electronic filing manager, which is eFile Texas, so that the clerks can then review those documents. Once it's into the eFile manager, the clerks then review those documents, and what they'll do is they'll either accept it or they'll return it for correction. And later, we'll talk about some of the reasons why you see a return for correction. Here in the state of Texas, you see about a 93% acceptance rate. So there's very little reasons for return for correction. In fact, some of those reasons have been recently standardized by the Supreme Court. So we'll talk about what some of those reasons are and what some of the common ones we see throughout the state. So assuming that the clerk accepts it, which happens the majority of the time, that document gets stamped and gets sent in two different directions. The first direction it gets sent is into the case management system for the clerks. The second way is a file stamp copy gets sent back to that original filer so that they have a copy of that document right there in real time. Okay? We talked about these electronic filing service providers, but if we look at it from an oversight as far as the EFSP landscape, we look at it with several entities today that are basically expressed their intent of becoming one of these electronic filing service providers. Now, this number continues to fluctuate and increase quite often, so you'll have to excuse me for just a second. Right now, it's at 23 entities that have expressed their intent to be one of these electronic filing service providers. Now, 6 of these entities were previous entities that existed in the previous e-filing system. So all of the entities that were in that e-filing system before using that Texas.gov environment have just transitioned over to eFile Texas. They all will still exist and still remain. What that means to you from the filing community is if you've ever used e-filing in any county across this great state, you can use that same process and you probably would not experience any change. Okay. Now, just because I express my intent to become one of these electronic filing service providers does not necessarily mean that I get to be one. Every one of these companies that say, hey, I want to be an EFSP and act as the portal to give the information from the filer to the clerk have to go through a rigorous certification process. Now, that certification process is actually governed and put and administered by the Office of Administration. And they put these entities through a 2-week-long series of tests just to ensure that they have the ability to not only take the information from the filer, pass it to the clerk, but then get that information back from the clerk and give it back to the filer. To date, we have several EFSPs that are certified and actually in existence today. Maybe a little difficult to see it up here, but those are the ones that are listed in bold. And we'll talk a little bit more about these EFSPs and how you can choose the one that's right for you in a little bit. Next, I'd like to talk about the filing mechanics and how it all works. We've looked at it from a high level, but I want to get more granular so that you guys have a better understanding of how the e-filing process works. Regardless of the electronic filing service provider that you choose to utilize, the series of steps are pretty much the same. Every one of them will require you to go in and actually register as a user in the system. This is just ensuring that you have a user ID and a password so that when you log into the system, they know who you are. A lot of times you see this registration process in things like an email address or maybe even an Amazon account. It's the same process. The system just needs to identify who you are so that when you file documents, they know who it is that's filing it. It's a one-time pre-setup that you need to do, regardless of the electronic filing service provider that you use. But once that's set up, you follow a series of steps to file your documents. Now, what I want to do is go through the most complex way, which is a brand new case. The case already exists and you're just filing a subsequent filing into it. The steps decrease pretty substantially. But assuming that this is a brand new case, it's a 5-step process. The first step is you need to enter in the case information. Because this is a statewide system, you need to tell us what county you're filing it in and what county office you're filing it in. You also need to enter in the information as what case type are you choosing to file, who the attorney is that's filing it, and what payment account that you're choosing to utilize. How are you going to pay for it? Much like you would do if you were going to file this over the counter today. Second thing that you need to do is you need to put in the party information. Who are the parties on the case, whether it be a plaintiff and a defendant, a petitioner and a respondent, an applicant and a decedent, whatever it may be, you're entering in that information and the attorneys who are representing them. The third thing is you're entering in what it is that you're filing. If this were an original initial filing for a new case, it's probably either an application or an original petition. You file that original petition, you're entering in that information. This is the time that you saved off that PDF document that you would use it and attach it to the e-filing system. This is a very similar process to what you experience today when you've ever added an attachment to an email. Very similar. The fourth step is an optional step. This optional step is to set up your electronic service contacts in the event that you want to electronically serve someone on a subsequent filing. It's important to note here that electronic service does not take the place of personal service. So if you still need to personally serve somebody with that citation and either the constable or a private process server helping you out, you still have to go through that process. Electronic service contacts is just setting it up so that if you subsequently file a motion later on in the case and you want to serve that electronically and make sure the opposing counsel gets it, you can set up those contacts here. Most of the folks that we see use the system skip this optional step and set up these electronic service contacts when they want to utilize them, because the parties may change and the attorneys and counsel who are representing those parties may vary as well later on in the case. So most people skip this step and go right into the last step. If you've ever bought anything online or if you've ever used any kind of online purchasing system, you usually get a final opportunity to review your order before you place it. So it'll be just the same thing in the e-filing system. You'll get an opportunity to review your filing before you hit that submit button. You get an opportunity to make sure you're filing it in the right county, you're filing in the right county office, you're filing it with the right party information, and you're filing the correct document to the clerk for them to accept your information. So I want to move on into something that everyone tends to have great interest in, and this is the cost component that's associated with e-filing. Now what I want to do is I want to bring it into two different flavors. I want to break it down into a cost component structure so that you guys can see it broken down line item by line item and know where that money's going. But then the second part is I want to put it into a scenario format and use a divorce case so that everybody can kind of get on the same page and see it from a different perspective. If we were to look at the e-filing cost today using the eFile Texas system, it's really broken down into 3 different cost components. The first one is identified by that black button. That's the electronic filing service provider button. Now, this black button indicates the eFSP that you chose to utilize when filing. And we do have free offerings out there where there's eFSPs that cost $0 to use, but they do range all the way up and can charge as much as they actually want. We see the highest eFSP charging about $12 per filing today. That's per submission, meaning that if you file an original petition, that's $12. You turn right back around and file a motion and affidavit later, that'll be another $12. You have the option to choose a cost-free solution or choose another electronic filing service provider that may charge you based on the services that they provide. That, once again, is identified by that black button here. The blue button is the electronic filing manager. That electronic filing manager is the eFile Texas system. That's who we're here representing today. And we're going to charge you $0 to use our system. Just kind of take a step back. We mentioned that previous system, that Texas.gov environment. The Texas.gov environment actually charged you about $10.50 per file to use that system. And it was broken down by 2 different cost components. One was about $5 for an initial filing and $5.50 for any kind of electronic service. Assuming you use both of them, you add those 2, get together with the $10.50. You're going to get charged $0 with the blue button, which is the electronic filing manager here. Now, the county offices are identified by this gray button. County offices have the ability to charge a $2 cost recovery fee. Now, this $2 cost recovery fee is to help them recover any kind of cost that was associated with implementing an e-filing solution within their respective office. This is not a county by county, this is an office by office basis. Now, this information has to be reported to the state. Before they can even begin collecting the $2 fee, the counties have to reach out to the state and try to become certified by submitting an application to be qualified to collect this $2 fee. They then have to report their earnings annually to the state, because once they recover their cost of implementing an electronic filing system, they can no longer charge this $2 fee. This $2 fee also sunsets in 2018, so it will not be here forever in the event that some of those offices are due charging it today. People ask me all the time, what are some of the reasons why a county would charge it? What kind of cost would be associated with an e-filing implementation? Let's say that their e-filing network, so the network, the computer information internet network that they use is not good enough to get all of those electronic filings coming in at the same time. They may need to beef it up and get a bigger bandwidth so that they can have more electronic traffic coming through their offices. They may choose to purchase new computers that can help them process this information faster, or even dual monitors to help them be able to get this information in and work more proactively and more aggressively on getting these things and electronic filings approved. Once they recover the cost of whatever that may be, then they can no longer assess that fee. So if we look at it across the board, you can see it range from anywhere from $0, depending upon whether the county chooses to assess that $2 cost recovery fee and whether or not you chose a cost-free electronic filing service provider, all the way up to $14. So depending upon the choices that you make with your electronic filing service provider and whether that county office is actually assessing that $2 fee, it can range on a per filing basis. We were to take the same information and we would plug it in and just put it in a scenario format with a divorce case. It would look something similar to this. I'm just going to assume that the divorce fee would be $275 for the court costs and fees that you would normally pay if you were paying it over the counter. I know that the monetary value that is assessed on a per county basis for a divorce case changes based on local rules and some of the statutes that they have there. But let's just assume $275 just to level set. From there, what we did is we reached out to the Office of Court Administration and said, just on average, can you give us the number of filings that you would have on a case record? And they said that that was pretty difficult to do because you may just have that original petition filed with that default judgment, but you may also have hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands, of filings on a case record. So we just took a round number and used 10. We use that 10 and we multiply it by the previous cost component total that we acquired, either $0 to $14. You can see the difference here. Multiply that on a per filing basis, and this is what you come out with. So with $275 being the same thing that you would pay if you were filing over the counter, and all the way up to $415, the price could vary. But once again, this is going to be dependent upon whether that $2 cost recovery fee is being collected, and then whether or not you choose an electronic filing service provider that's free versus one that does charge an amount to use their services. A good place to get all of this information and a good place to see a lot of the information that we talked about today is on our website. If you go out to eFileTexas.gov, this website is the central portal for all the news and information that we have for e-filing. Anything that we have or we get from the Supreme Court or from the OCA or anything that's pertinent to e-filing is put here on this website. In fact, the very first thing that we do is we ask you a question on this website. And the question is up here, but it may be difficult to read. It asks you, do you have a service provider? If you say yes, it gives you a list of those certified service providers so that you can click on it and go right to that web page of that service provider and get started. If you say no, it takes you to a cost comparison chart, so you can compare apples to apples between all the different service providers. You can find out what they charge and why they charge a service fee, what kind of services they offer that may warrant that fee. You may also find out what kind of training offerings that they have, right? You may also find out what kind of support offerings they have in the event you file something and have some trouble and need some help. So I encourage you guys to go out and take a look at that comparison chart, find out the right EFSP that's right for you. We also actually link to a website called the Judicial Committee of Information Technology. We call it JCIT for short. JCIT's important part in the whole judicial process is to really work through some of the technological advances that are coming to life and try to evaluate and analyze those and try to determine which ones of those may be beneficial for the state of Texas' judicial process. They make these recommendations on what kind of technological advances that the Supreme Court should adopt to the Supreme Court, and a lot of the times the Supreme Court takes that recommendations and suggestions and puts them into play. We link to that information so that you know what's coming up, what may change, what may be coming in the future. We also, from the eFileTexas.gov, link to the portal in which the reviewers or the clerks go in and review the documents that you submit. I always think that it's beneficial for you guys, the filing community, to take a look and see what the filers see, but also what the clerks see after you file something. So that's what we'll take a look at next. If we were to look at this screen up here, it may be a little difficult to see, so I'll just call out some pretty key points at a high level. It's broken down into three different quadrants. The upper left-hand quadrant is a quadrant that contains the documents that are being filed. I try to stress the word documents as plural because the previous system that charges you that $10.50 per filing only allows you to file one filing per submission. eFile Texas, we're going to give you the ability to file as many filings in one submission as you want to, with the one caveat that it's on the same case record. Right? So if you're filing it in one case record, you have a motion and affidavit and maybe another motion that you want to put on, you can file all those at the same exact time and not have to do 3 separate submissions. What this gives the clerks the ability to do is to review each one of those independently of each other. So if 2 of them get approved and 1 of them needs to be corrected, they can approve those 2 and send the other one back and ask you to correct it in some form or fashion. The bottom below that left top quadrant is the left bottom quadrant. That's all the information that you would have entered in before. That's the information like what county you filed it into, what county office you filed it into, what case type. It even goes in and tells you what judge is actually hearing that case, who the parties are on the case, and any financial information that's specific to this individual filing. To the right, in the main working space here, you see what the clerks see, and this is how they review your document. They have the ability to go in and view that document to make sure that that document that they actually attach is the document that you said it was. So if you're filing an original petition, you're not actually scanning in a picture of your dog. The other thing is in the upper right-hand corner, if you were to look at that, there's several different actions that the clerk has the ability to do. They have the ability to mark up this document, make some changes, or maybe even highlight some information so that when they return it to you, you have the ability to look at that document and find out exactly why they're returning it to you. Now, most of the time we talked about a 93% today, and it's continuing to increase in acceptance rate here in the state of Texas from the counties that are live. You do see the acceptance happening the majority of the time, but there are some instances when the clerk can return it for correction. And they'll use that top right-hand corner to choose the action to return it for correction back to you. When they do, they can specify a reason and add comments as to why they're returning it back to you. What I think is beneficial is to see some of those reasons that we see that are common across the state through our experience on why some of these filings are getting returned back for correction to the filer. Some of the common reasons that we see today is, number one, if the document is unsigned. If it needs to be signed and it isn't signed, sometimes the clerk will return it back to you and ask you to sign it. Now, electronic signatures is a difficult topic because everybody thinks of electronic signatures differently. I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court rules that were adopted on January 1st of this year actually define an electronic signature as a signature of that individual. But they also give you an out in the event that you don't have a signature pad to actually create your electronic signature. If you actually use /s/space followed by your name, that's an acceptable form of electronic signature, and that's defined in the rule set for the Supreme Court. So that may be one reason. A secondary reason may be the wrong case number. Maybe you were filing it into 123, but the document actually was for case 456. They may return it back to you and say, I think you may have selected the wrong case. You may want to look at this and resubmit it. If it's the right case, cool. Go ahead and send it back and we'll accept it. Where we see this is not always on the case number itself, but also on the county. Sometimes you're trying to file it into the county, and because it is a statewide system, you actually click the drop-down box, and instead of choosing Wichita County, you choose Webb County or Williamson County, which is right next to it. If that happens, they may return it back to you and say, I think you may have filed it into the wrong county, so you may want to reinvestigate, reanalyze that file. If you look at the third option is a faulty document. If the document comes over and it's illegible, which happens from time to time, it may be sent back to you and ask you to rescan it or resend it through. It's important to note that it has to be the state-defined standards, which is an 8.5 by 11 searchable PDF properly rotated. I say properly rotated because, believe it or not, a lot of times when documents are scanned in, they accidentally scan in upside down, and if it comes across the scan in upside down, it becomes a blank document to the clerk where they can't see anything. They may return it back to you and ask you to correct that, and please resend it. Now, I'll go ahead and address one of the questions that I always get about this. Is in the event that I submit a document and I've got a deadline that's due today, and it gets reviewed tomorrow by the clerk and it gets returned for correction, I then turn around and resubmit it maybe Friday afternoon. What is the date that is actually qualified as the acceptance date? It's the date that you originally submitted it. The clerk has the ability to specify what the duration is that they're going to allow you to then turn around and resubmit that document. And then we'll use that original submission date from the original submission. Okay? All right. So as we go in and implement this throughout the state of Texas, we have a responsibility from an electronic filing manager vendor. Whether documents are introduced electronically through the legal professionals like yourselves, or whether it's introduced as a pro se litigant, it changes the way the courts do business. And if you were to think about it today, when you hand something over the counter today, the clerk usually does a few things. The first thing that they usually do is, if you brought a copy, that's great. If you didn't, they make a copy for you and they stamp those documents, bonk, bonk. They hand one of them back to you and put the other one in a file folder. And that's usually what we see when we're on the other side of the counter. But when we go back behind the other side of the counter on the clerk's side, that document in that physical file folder is passed to other clerks for them to go do different things. Maybe it's for someone to go and take a payment on the case. Maybe it's for someone to go and schedule a hearing and send out hearing notices. Maybe it's for someone to go in and put a time tickler on it so that they can keep track of that next item that's due 10 days from today. When you have that physical document, it's easy to track that because I can hand it over to Dennis and ask Dennis to go do what his step is in the process. But if that physical document ceases to exist, how do we handle it? There's lots of exits to paper, things like hearing notices, which we talked about just a minute ago, the physical file folder itself, even receipts from payments. There's several different ways where the exit out of an electronic system can go into paper. And so what we're doing is we're partnering with each of the justice partners throughout the state, and we're actually working with them to help define some of these areas where electronic efficiencies can be capitalized on. Now, what we've seen is a very, very big mixture of different counties handling this different ways. Some counties have said, hey, you know what, this is just an introduction from an electronic system, from a filing standpoint, and we're going to handle the business just as we've always done, and that's fantastic. There's other counties that say, well, I want to look at some of these electronic efficiencies and maybe capitalize on some of those processes and implement them in our courts. And if that's the case, then what we'll do is we'll work with the counties to make sure that those visions of electronic efficiencies become a reality, but not introduce it abruptly. We'll introduce it very slowly, we'll document it, be very transparent, make that readily available on the internet so that you can read it, understand it before it actually becomes implemented. Two things that I'd like to point out is the statewide e-filing rules and the Judicial Committee of Information Technology standards. The statewide e-filing rules were adopted and put in effect on January 1 of this year. It makes note of a lot of questions that you may have about e-filing. Things like, when is a document deemed filed? And how do I handle my probated will. It goes into that in great detail. So if you haven't read the new standards that were approved and put into effect on January 1 of this year, I encourage you to go do that. It has a lot of good information specifically around e-filing. In addition to that, we talked about the Judicial Committee of Information Technology earlier. JCIT has been working very diligently with the Supreme Court to actually identify and solidify a common set of codes that are used across the state. Those state codes started off with the case categories, the case types, and the filing codes, and they're moving into other things like parties and optional services later. They've been adopted already, they've been approved by the Supreme Court, and are being rolled out across the state. What that will mean to you guys is whether you're filing here or filing in a neighboring county, the filing options that you see will be identical. So you'll get the same look, the same feel, the same experience regardless of which county you're filing it in. We've got links to both of these documents at the bottom of each one of the documents, images that you see up here on the screen. At the end of the presentation, if we haven't done so already, what we'll do is we'll give the presentation out to Patrick so that he can actually divvy it out to anybody who actually would like to see this. Fast way to go see this instead of digging through the internet is just to click on one of these links and it'll take you right there so you can read up more about it. Lastly, I want to talk about the timeline. How does it impact you guys here in Wichita County? When we talked about implementing e-filing across the state, we really broke it into two different categories. The first one meaning the current courts that were previously filing on that previous vendor. We had a responsibility to get those counties, regardless of whether it was the entire county or maybe just one of the offices, live on our system so that the other system could go offline. We spent last year working on that and then spent all the first couple of months this year focusing on refining those and making sure that everything was good and ready to go so that they were comfortable using the system moving forward. But as we step into the new year, we focus on the new courts that maybe haven't had e-filing in their offices or in their counties. When we look at that group, that's who we're focusing on today. And that's where Wichita County falls into play. If we look at an example court transition timeline, it's really broken down into 6 different steps. 5 steps from kickoff all the way into a permissive go-live. And usually you go live in a permissive environment well before your mandatory environment, your mandatory deadline that's defined by the Supreme Court, to give you some time to get acclimated to using e-filing. So it's not just that Band-Aid rip off of that. When we look at this process and you look at the different steps along the way, the timeline is about 2 to 5 months from the time that we kick the project off to the time that they go live. A good example is we kicked off Wichita County here in March, and they're live on a permissive environment as of May 20th. If you look at the different steps that are along the way, the one key thing that I would bring to your attention would be the training step. The training step is dependent upon the eFSP that you choose to utilize, which makes it more important for you to select that right electronic filing service provider. As you go to those comparison charts and look at that information, you may notice that some of them just give you documentation, or others give you online training videos. You may even have some that give live training in the form of a webinar where you can attend and ask questions at the end. So I encourage you to go take a look and find the right eFSP that's right for you. It's important to note that once you sign up for an eFSP, you're not locked into it. So if you want to go and try one out, great. If you don't like it, move on. I even had a lot of attorneys ask me, can I use multiple electronic filing service providers? Absolutely. We encourage it if it actually fits your business need, if it helps you out. We see some electronic filing service providers that may charge a fee, but provide a service that may be applicable and useful for that attorney on one case type that they work with. But maybe they use a free option for the others. So I encourage you to go and look at those different e-filing service providers and find the right one for you. If I could end in 3 different steps and 3 different recommendations that I could close out with. Number 1 is if you haven't reviewed the e-filing rules and procedures, I strongly encourage you to go do that. That's an important part, I think, in understanding what e-filing is and what the new rules say. A lot of that information, a lot of the questions that we typically have are found directly in what the rules say about electronic filing. Secondly, I would say go out and find the right electronic filing service provider. There's no right one for everybody and one that you should go use. You should find the one that is right for you. Use the ones that you feel comfortable with. And then lastly, I would say start exercising the system. With Wichita being live already on a permissive environment, use the system and get familiar with it before that mandatory date of January 1. I would encourage you not to start off with something that's the most complex or the most challenging, but maybe something like a motion that doesn't have any kind of time sensitive durations tied to it. Maybe something that is very simple and easy. And just follow that one document, see how it goes. If you need help, reach out to the support line on that EFSP and they'll walk you through step by step on how to do that. Get comfortable with doing this and maybe start increasing your filings electronically until you get to a point where you say, hey, when that mandatory date comes, it's ready to use the system. The other reason I would recommend doing it early is because some people are procrastinators. I just say some because I know that there are a lot, but they'll wait till that very last minute. If you do that, you happen to be one of those individuals and wait till that January 1 deadline, then chances are there's probably a lot of other folks who are doing the same thing. And if you have questions or need some assistance, you're going to pick up the phone and call that support line. You may experience wait times. You call the support line right now, you're going to get right in because there's not a lot of people that are just calling that support line. They've already become acclimated to the system. The other thing that this does is benefit the clerks because it gives them the ability to become acclimated to receiving that information as well. So if I could leave you with something, I would encourage you to go out and start using it just very slowly and get familiar with how to use the system before that January 1st deadline hits. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to any questions that you guys may have.
Chairman, I'll go ahead and start with, I know that some of the issues that we've had in the office have dealt with exhibits or attachments and things that we used to file as a package that we're now having to turn back for refiling. Or a good case in point, an original answer with a motion to transport venue. We're now being told, okay, you've got to do those separately. Would you explain kind of what that process is?
Absolutely. So the question is that there's several documents that are out there, and as we're filing those documents, you got things that are different where you usually filed maybe a motion and an answer at the same time. And now you're being told that you have to file them separately. So with the e-filing system, you can file them at the same time, but the challenge is that you can't file them as attachments. So you have a lead document is what most of the electronic filing service providers call those lead documents, and then you have attachments to that document. The way that the system is designed to work is that those lead documents act as the documents that will be docketed on that case management system, and those are the ones that receive the file stamp, not the attachments. So in the previous, we usually thought of it as being that answer and that motion, and one of them being attached to the other. In reality, they are submitted together. But the way that you handle that is you actually have a lead document with the motion, and you create another lead document as an answer inside of that one submission that you submit. If you handle it like that, both of those documents will get the file stamp, which is usually what the clerks are wanting. Now, I can't speak for every clerk because every clerk likes things differently in their case management systems, which is the system that hosts and holds all of the information that you guys are filing today. That system changes depending upon which CMS vendor that they have. CMS is just short for case management system. So depending upon that, certain case management systems may handle it a little differently. So the clerk may have a different way that they'd like for you to do that. Most of those business processes are being thought out well before that mandatory date, and that's some of the information that we're trying to document and make readily available online so that you guys can read up about how it's going to be handled in the counties that you're filing in. Yes, sir.
How do you file the original will electronically?
Okay, so the question is, how do you file an original will? Okay, so the Supreme Court actually defines this. The Supreme Court says that you file the application online electronically, but within 3 business days, you have to then turn in that actual original will to the clerk's office. So you file the application online, you then turn around and 3 days later, within a 3-day business day time period, take that will up to the office just like you normally would.
Does the application have its file? Does it have a copy of the will attached to it?
So the question is when you file that application, you have to have a copy of it. It really is a business process question. The answer is no, you don't have to, but some clerks are asking for the first page of that will. A lot of clerks are just saying, I don't really care, as long as you submit the application and within 3 days, bring me that will, we're good. So it's really a business process question based on the county clerk's office that you're filing with. Yes, sir.
Why do you need an electronic service or filing manager? Why isn't it possible to just create a document in PDF and send it directly to the clerk, similar to the way you do it, I understand, in the federal system?
Okay, so the question is, why do you need an electronic filing manager? Why can't you just create a PDF document and submit it similar to what you do in maybe the PACER system, the federal system? This is the same thing. PACER is an e-filing manager. eFile Texas is an e-filing manager as well. It's just a different system, but it does the exact same thing. So eFile Texas is just the local government version of the federal system of PACER, if you will.
But in the federal system, there's not the other contractor filing service provider. Why is that necessary in the states?
Gotcha. So the question is the EFM, I got it. It's the same as the Pacer account, or an equal member of the Pacer account relative to its market space. But what's the need for that electronic filing service provider, and why do you have to have that additional layer to submit your documents? The electronic filing service provider is part of the agreement with the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court and the Office of Court Administration went out to bid for this contract, they wanted it to be an open market to encourage people to keep challenging and keep it innovating and keep on getting better and better. As part of that, that's the output of it, is we've got multiple electronic filing service providers that came to it. It's important to note that eFileTexas.gov, which is the e-filing manager, is an electronic filing service provider that is free. So if you want to file directly into the e-filing system, just like you do with the Pacer account, you have the option to do so. Yes, sir.
We've had issues with the appellate courts, mostly on searchable documents and particularly bookmarks. When you file a brief in Court of Appeals now, it seems that you have to use Adobe Acrobat rather than the WordPerfect or the free software out there to satisfy the Court of Appeals. Are we going to have to do that to file documents locally, or will WordPerfect and conventional scanning programs suffice for what we're doing locally?
Great question. So with the appellate courts, they're asking you to submit everything in PDF, and usually you like having those documents in Word documents. And the question is as we move away from the appellate courts and focus more on county level, like Wichita County, do we have to follow the same rules? Yeah, you do, but I can elaborate a little bit on that. In terms of the documents themselves, the state rules require it to be an 8.5 by 11 searchable PDF document. You can generate that document from Word or WordPerfect by just going to File, Save As, and then change it to PDF as opposed to a Word document, and it creates that searchable 8.5 by 11 PDF document that you need. In regards to Adobe Acrobat, it's a very expensive system, and it is the market leader. I mean, it is one of the highest ones, but I would encourage you to go out and look for a PDF reader that doesn't cost anything, because there are several out there. Just off the top of my head, QPDF is a highly used one. Another one that is commonly used is one called Foxit PDF. Both of those are free substitutions, so you don't have to pay anything to get a PDF reader. They'll do the same thing that Adobe Acrobat will, and allow you to file those things through the PDF requirements by the state. What else? What else can I help out with? Yes, sir.
Do the attachments to pleadings have to also be searchable PDF?
It depends. It really
You're
is.
scanning in a photograph, or you're scanning in, something from a contract that you need as an exhibit.
The question is do the attachments have to be searchable PDF as well? The state defines every document that goes through the system as being a searchable PDF. Exhibits are excluded, so if you want to go in and bring that document up manually or bring it to court when your court has a hearing, you can do that instead. But yeah, they're asking that everything comes through the system as a PDF document. Yes, sir.
How are pro se litigants going to be able to file? A lot of them can barely handle paper and pen.
Right. The question is how are pro se litigants able to file? I mean, a lot of them find it difficult to file in the court system, let alone electronically file. The pro se litigants are not included in the mandate. The mandate actually excludes those pro se litigants. Interesting thing though is what we've seen a large portion of pro se litigants use the e-filing system just due to it being free. And so we see some of that happen, but pro se litigants still have the ability to walk up to the counter and file it in the traditional manner, even after the mandatory 8 days. Great question. Anything else I can answer? Yes, ma'am. How are orders handled? Great question. So orders are a little bit different because orders are actually, even though a lot of times they're generated and built by the attorney, it's really a courtesy to the judge. It really doesn't become an order until the judge actually signs it. So because it is actually a generated order and becomes official document of the court after the signature, it's generated by the judge themselves. So orders are actually excluded from the mandate. You can handle them just as you do. However, we have seen some counties actually implement different ways, like being able to submit a proposed order online, and through the e-filing system, they route it to the judge and get the signature. Obviously, some of those orders are okay to do that, but if you got like a TRO or an EPO, obviously that's not how you want to handle it. So I would encourage you to reach out to your county office and ask how they want you to handle it, but you can still bring those directly in if you like. Yes, sir.
You have to regularly have multiple logins for the firm, having one login.
Great question. You recommend having multiple logins with the firm or just one? In terms of the firm itself, the majority of the EFSPs have what we call a firm administrator, where you can set up an individual account that's a firm admin that can basically oversee that entire firm. What we see usually and traditionally is that we have someone that sets that up as like a generic email address for that firm, and then every attorney then files or sets up their own account underneath that firm. So they're associated with the firm, but they have their own account so that when it's filed, it knows that it's coming in from that firm, but actually by that attorney. In regards to setting up accounts and user IDs and passwords, we talked about that registration process. Once you do that registration process with one of the EFSPs, the remaining electronic filing service providers will use that same user ID and same password. So you can log in with one and log into the others once you get registered. The only exception to that is Filing Serve Express. They handle things a little differently. They have their own unique user IDs and unique passwords, so if you were to use them, you would have to reach out to them and get that user ID and password that may be different from the one that just set up in the e-filing system. But from the most part, we see a firm admin, and then we see individual attorneys within that firm. Yes, ma'am.
If I have service contacts set up on the system, but they're using a different EFSP, is the system still going to use whatever it is to serve them with those documents?
Absolutely. So the question is if I have an electronic filing service provider contact, e-service contact set up, but they're using a different EFSP, will it still work? Yeah, it's a centralized system, so all the electronic service contacts are in the system and pulled directly from each EFSP. So they actually come into the e-filing manager, pull those service contacts, and that's what's displayed on the screen. So it's regardless of which EFSP that they choose to utilize. We also do some data cleanup behind the scenes because there could be 15 different John Smiths with the same email address. What we do is we go in and eliminate duplicates on a nightly basis and keep the ones that are a registered user. They're not a registered user, we take them out because they need to be a registered user in the system. The second thing is that we go in and we actually will eliminate any of those electronic filing service providers, electronic service contacts in the event that there's duplicates and they were not created by the firm in which they reside. So if I've got a different opposing firm that's going out and just adding a bunch of service contacts out there, we don't know if those emails are actually legitimate, so we actually, there's multiple out there, we'll eliminate all of the ones except for the ones that were created by that service provider, or that firm in which they reside. Anything else I can talk about? Yes, sir.
I want to work backwards. In the paper world, someone comes into my office, they've been added to a party to an existing case, there's already a bunch of filings, litigation going on. If I want to see that file, I go down to the clerk's office, I pull the paper file, and I can review every filing in the thing. Same scenario, but in the electronic world, how am I going to access documents that have been filed electronically by other lawyers at other times in the case if I want to review the case file? Is there a way to do that with the eFile system?
Great question. So the question is how do I go in and view the documents that may have been filed by other opposing counsels in the e-filing system? The e-filing system is actually just the introduction of the documents. It's just an electronic filing system. It's not a document repository. A lot of the case management vendors that are out there offer a public access system, which allows folks to go in and basically view that information online. Some of them charge a fee, some of them are free, but that's really the responsibility of that case management system. So I would ask the case management system vendor for Wichita County, wherever that may be, what their solution is for that, because that would be the route that you're going to go. The e-filing system is just an introduction system to get that document to the clerks. It's not an online repository.
Terry, we've got them here today, so why don't we have them address that?
Well, that can be done. Go ahead.
I was going to tell them, we will have two computers in our office public session, and then Sherry, the law office, will have her 4 machines, special access students. So if you want to do an e-file, you do it in the law library or in our office, we do that on machines for them. So you can sit at they will look through the file.
So I'd be able to use one of those case by case number, and every filing got electronically as we filed that case. I can do that in my office.
Can do that from your office as well. Wichita County has not subscribed to that at this point, but that is available. I'm just telling you, that is something that they haven't subscribed to that service.
It's a great question. Anything else?
It's whatever they're saying.
All right. Well, guys, hey, thank you very much. Dennis and I will stick around in case you guys have any other questions. I really appreciate your time and the opportunity to come speak with you guys today.